Anyway, so I started looking into these historical figures, and Tully and Ochoa is one of the biggest names in Arizona history. In Arizona, nobody knows they got their start in New Mexico. So this is a little bit of a biography about Estevan Ochoa, just to kind of give you a background of that. Tucson, mid-1870s. Main Street is congested with freight wagons and the air is filled with dust and the raucous call of teamsters as they maneuver their teams of mules and wagons to various mercantile stores. While many visitors describe Tucson as an unimpressive Mexican town, signs of progress were everywhere. New buildings were going up, old ones were being repaired and renovated, proudly displaying their new coats of white plaster. Amid the chaos, pedestrians going about their business carefully picked their way through debris and mud. Occasionally, in the hustle and bustle, one pedestrian stands out. In this case, as John Bork described, a, quote, rather undersized gentleman coming down the street is a man with a history. Perhaps it might be perfectly correct to say with 2 or 3 histories. He is Don Estevan Ochoa, one of the coolest and bravest men in all of the southwestern country. He has a handsome face, a keen black eye, a quick business-like air with very polished and courteous manners. This quiet, unassuming man was a daring entrepreneur who was a citizen of the country in the original sense of the word, filled with compassion for his fellow human beings as he endeavored to improve himself and the plight of those around him. Estevan Ochoa was one of the founding partners of Tully, Ochoa and Company, along with Pinckney R. Tully. Their names have become synonymous with the rise and fall of the freighting industry of territorial Arizona, with many historians mentioning the firm as an example of pre-railroad days when Mexican-American and Anglo businessmen joined together in a variety of ventures. In fact, many articles and books prominently highlight Estevan Ochoa for his business success and his leadership of the Mexican-American community of Tucson. But little in-depth attention has been given to the background of Ochoa, the origins of his partnership with Tully, his extensive interactions with the Apache Indians, and the extent of his civic works to help his community. Ochoa was born on March 17, 1831, in San Jeronimo de Aldama, Chihuahua, Mexico, into a family of prosperous merchants, ranchers, miners, and freighters. His cousins, the Aguirres, lived on a hacienda nearby. About 1852, the Ochoa and Aguirre families decided to move north when news circulated throughout Chihuahua of the bustling economy in the Mesilla Valley of the Rio Grande, north of El Paso del Norte, today's Ciudad Juarez. The village of Mesilla had been founded 2 years before on the west side of the Rio Grande, across from the new American town of Las Cruces, settled mostly by New Mexicans who did not want to live under American rule after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848. Mesilla had quickly grown into a commercial center. Pedro Aguirre Sr., wanting to expand his freighting and other businesses, led his family and a large caravan of followers north, including the Ochoa family. At the time, the border with Mexico was still in dispute, so both the Ochoas and Aguirres chose to settle on the east side of the Rio Grande to ensure that they would be in the United States. Pedro Aguirre Sr. soon established a cattle ranch and bought some farming properties between Las Cruces and Doña Ana. For the Ochoas, Estevan chose to purchase land adjacent to his cousin, while his father, Jesus, tried ranching downriver near present-day Anthony, New Mexico. Estevan soon experienced one of the inherent problems of ranching in southern New Mexico, raids by Apaches. On the night of December 22, 1852, Apaches stole 18 oxen from the Rancho de Estevan Ochoa. Ochoa asked 2 local men to help him trail the thieves, following them westward toward the Gila River, but never catching up with the Indians or oxen. Suspecting they were Gila or Mimbres Apaches, on February 5, 1853, Ochoa rode to the Mimbres River in western New Mexico to the newly established Fort Webster and New Mexico Indian Sub-Agency for the Mimbres and Chihenne Apaches to file a complaint with the Indian agent for the loss of 18 oxen valued at $720. It is unclear if he was reimbursed by the government. The government trough was an important source of income for many frontier businessmen, and Ochoa was soon able to partake in contracts to supply the same Indian agency with items for distribution to the Apaches. Although only in his early 20s, Estevan Ochoa already had success and was highly regarded by many territorial officials. In October of 1853, while at Fort Webster during one of the distribution of rations to the Apaches, the Indian agent asked Ochoa for aid in a delicate problem. When Apaches gathered on the Membres River to receive their provisions, they often brought with them their Mexican captives, taken during raids in Sonora and Chihuahua. The commander of the fort, Major Enoch Steen, would forcibly take from the Apaches any captives he saw. So instead, some of the Apaches approached the Indian agent, saying they would release their two currently held captives for a price. The New Mexico governor had explicitly denied the agent permission to buy captives, as it would only encourage the Apaches to take more on their raids and then sell them to the Americans. But wanting to rescue these captives, the agent requested Estevan Ochoa, a private citizen, to purchase them, which he gladly did. In early 1854, Fort Webster was abandoned and the troops moved to the new Fort Thorne, located on the Rio Grande, next to the settlement of Santa Barbara near present-day Hatch, New Mexico. By August, the Indian Agency had also moved to Santa Barbara under the management of a new Indian agent, Dr. Michael Steck. With the new fort and Indian Agency at the upper reaches of the Mesilla Valley, the farmers, ranchers, and businessmen of Mesilla and Las Cruces had a very accessible market for their products. Estevan Ochoa was one of the first contractors for the new agency, delivering corn. Within a couple of days of this delivery, Dr. Steck hired him as the new interpreter for the agency to assist Steck during the distribution of rations to various bands of the Gila Apaches at Fort Thorne. Most of the Apaches spoke Spanish, so Ochoa helped Steck communicate with his charges. Consequently, Ochoa interacted with such Apache leaders as Mangas Coloradas, Delgadito, and Cuchillo Negro, as well as some of the Mescalero bands. Ochoa also assisted Steck in communicating with Mexican officials in Chihuahua, usually regarding livestock stolen from the Indians by Mexican bandits or about returning Mexican captives from the Apaches. At this time, Estevan Ochoa met his future partner, Pinckney R. Tully, a man who also had several histories. Tully had come down the Santa Fe Trail about 1845, worked in Santa Fe mercantile stores, operated his own freight wagon, and served as interpreter during negotiation with various Pueblo tribes. He also drove sheep to California in 1853 and returned to New Mexico with Francis Xavier Aubrey on his exploration of the 35th parallel, during which Tully survived an attack by Indians in what is now north-central Arizona. Upon learning of the establishment of Fort Thorne, Tully in the spring of 1854 relocated to Santa Barbara, opening a mercantile store. When the Indian Agency also moved there, he rented several of his buildings to Agent Steck for his use. Consequently, Estevan Ochoa and Pinckney Tully often worked together to assist Dr. Steck as he dealt with various issues involving the Apaches. Ochoa served as Steck's interpreter until the end of 1855, after which he concentrated on his own freighting concern. Most accounts about Estevan Ochoa inaccurately claimed he learned the freighting business from his older brothers during trips up the Santa Fe Trail. However, Ochoa was the eldest of his siblings. Most likely, Ochoa learned the trade from his older cousin, Pedro Aguirre Sr., who was known to have owned freighting operations in Chihuahua, and who also set up his own sons in the freighting business on the Santa Fe Trail. And by the way, all of his Pedro Aguirre's sons were younger than Ochoa, so he couldn't have even learned it from those cousins as well. Perhaps using his salary of $500 per year as interpreter to acquire more wagons and livestock, Ochoa, within just a few months, was hauling freight for various parties. But his friend, Indian Agent Steck, would prove to be the most consistent source of employment. Dr. Steck had initiated relations with the Mescalero bands in the Sacramento Mountains, who were professing a desire for peace. Consequently, in November of 1856, Steck contracted with Ochoa to haul rations to the Mescaleros at Fort Stanton near present-day Ruidoso. Ochoa provided one wagon team with a teamster and a smaller wagon that he personally drove to transport Steck, his interpreter, and their baggage. Upon arriving at Fort Stanton, Estevan assisted in the distribution of rations to the mescaleros. Again, in November of 1857, Ochoa freighted the provisions to the mescaleros. But tensions between all Apache groups and the inhabitants of central and southern portions of New Mexico and what is now southern Arizona had been rising. In response, the military had opened new forts, including Fort Buchanan in the Sonoita Valley of southern Arizona in late spring of 1857. Probably a year later, Estevan Ochoa and Pedro Aguirre partnered to take advantage of the new market. In addition to Fort Buchanan, there was also the new mining town of Tubac. To be in the center of the rising activity, Ochoa established a ranch and mercantile store known as Ochoa House a few miles from Fort Buchanan. And as you can see, the red arrow up there shows you the Ochoa House. This is the 1860 map that Howard or Horace Grosvenor drew. I actually did not know until I found this map about exactly where Ochoa's ranch and house were. However, hostile activity in the area by Pinal and Coyotero Apaches was extremely high, and many of the ranchers and farmers in the Sonoita and Santa Cruz valleys lost livestock to Apache raids. In response, Dr. Steck made an effort to reach out to Cochise, the leader of the Choconan band of the Chiricahua Apaches, to negotiate a peace treaty. Cochise was the son-in-law of Mongus Coloradus, and Steck's cordial relationship with Mongus helped to broker a meeting. The Indian agent made arrangements to meet Cochise at Apache Pass in late December of 1858. Needing to haul a substantial amount of presents to help to win the Apache leader's goodwill, Steck called once again on his friend Estevan Ochoa to assist him. Steck, his new interpreter Santa Cruz Castaneda, and Ochoa with his wagon train journeyed first to the Mimbres Apaches at the Santa Rita del Cobre copper mines near present-day Silver City to distribute their quarterly rations, and then headed to Apache Pass. On December 30th, Steck met with Cochise and other individual chiefs, with Ochoa and Castaneda assisting in the talks and distributions of presents. This initial encounter went well, so Steck arranged to meet the Chiricahuas again on January 21, 1859, at Apache Pass to distribute more provisions and have the Choconans meet with Captain Richard S. Ewell, commander at Fort Buchanan, to formalize peace. Steck and Ochoa immediately headed for Fort Buchanan to inform Ewell of the arrangements. Upon their arrival, they received reports regarding stolen livestock and killings in the Santa Cruz, San Pedro, and Sonoita valleys, most likely perpetrated by Pinal and Coyotero Apaches, including a report of 8 mules taken from Ochoa's ranch. Before Steck and Ochoa had departed Apache Pass, by happenstance, 40 White Mountain Coyotero Apaches heading south to raid in Sonora stopped and met with Dr. Steck, once again with Ochoa and Castaneda's assistance. The Coyoteros agreed to forego their raid and return to their homes to ask their captains and principal warriors of their band to gather and meet with Steck and Captain Ewell on January 22nd at Santo Domingo Springs, 75 miles northeast of the Army post. The Coyoteros also requested that representatives of the Tohono O'odham be at the meeting, as they wanted to live in peace with them as well. But the U.S. Army had just completed a campaign against the Pinal and Coyoteros Apaches, potentially disrupting this upcoming negotiations. It was crucial that the next meeting with Cochise and the meeting with the Coyotero leaders went well. Steck realized he did not have enough provisions to distribute to both the Chiricahuas and the Coyoteros, nor time to return to his headquarters on the Rio Grande to obtain more. He turned to his friend Ochoa for a solution. One day before the rendezvous with Cochise in Apache Pass, Ochoa appeared with 30 fanegas of corn, 20 beef of cattle, most likely purchased from area farmers and ranchers, as well as in Sonora, where he had a network of resources. Steck and Ewell met with Cochise in Apache Pass as scheduled on January 21st, with Ochoa and Castaneda assisting in distribution of the cattle and corn and 30 pounds of tobacco. The next day, the Americans traveled to Santo Domingo Springs to meet with the White Mountain Coyoteros. The principal Coyotero chief assured Steck and Ewell of their desire for peace, after which Ochoa and Castaneda again assisted with the rations, as well as presents like tin cups and plates, hatchets, hoes, shirts, thread, needles, and brass kettles. Representatives at the Odom were also present and proclaimed amicable feelings toward the Coyoteros. As an extra bonus, 5 Pinal Apaches, one of the bands the Americans believed were committing most of the depredations in southern Arizona, were present and agreed to return to see if their leaders would meet and negotiate a peace treaty. Before Steck, Ochoa, and Castaneda could head back to the Rio Grande, they distributed another round of rations, first to the Mimbres Apaches at Santa Rita del Cobre on January 31st, and then immediately headed back to Apache Pass to give out provisions to the Chiricahuas on February 2nd. After traveling constantly for 2 months, Ochoa and his comrades were finally able to head home to the Rio Grande, reaching it within a few days. The respite was brief, as 2 weeks later, they retraced their steps westward, distributing rations to the Mimbres on February 28th and to the Chiricahuas a few days later. While Ochoa and the others were on the road, Captain Ewell sent word that the Pinal Apaches had requested a meeting on March 20th at Cañón del Oro, north of Tucson, on the north side of the Santa Catalina Mountains. They had heard Ewell was to commence a new campaign against the Pinals and wanted to negotiate a peace agreement. Steck now had to scramble to obtain the required provisions and presents for this crucial upcoming meeting, as he had only enough to distribute to the Coyotero Apaches at Santo Domingo on March 15th and to give to the Chiricahuas and Mimbres on his way home at the end of the month. While Steck ordered some supplies be sent from the agency headquarters, Estevan Ochoa was already engaged in obtaining cattle and corn, probably in Sonora, for the already scheduled distributions, and now needed to find another 40 head of beef and 130 fanegas of corn. Captain Ewell arrived at the site of the meeting at Cañón del Oro on March 19th, only to be met by a couple of representatives from the Pinals who informed him that their people were gathered in the Aravaipa Canyon and wanted to change the meeting to there. Ewell vehemently refused. The Pinals belatedly showed on March 22nd to begin talks the next day. However, Steck and Ochoa with the rations and gifts had not yet arrived due to bad roads caused by recent cold and stormy weather. Although they stayed, the Pinals were suspicious the Americans were not dealing in good faith since their presence were not there. Finally, on March 26, Steck, Ochoa, and Castaneda arrived. After the Pinals agreed to stop their raids, the agent and his companions handed out the gifts, which included 255 pounds of tobacco. At the conclusion of the meeting, Steck and his companions headed back to Apache Pass and the copper mines to distribute rations before returning to the Rio Grande. Although busy overseeing his freighting business and traveling with Steck, Ochoa also became involved in regional politics. He recognized that economic prosperity in the area was the best ways to help all citizens, not just business leaders like himself. While he was working with Steck, political events in southern New Mexico and present-day southern Arizona had been developing. The southern portion of the territory had long felt neglected by the territorial legislature, especially when it came to law and order and protection from the raiding Indians. The citizens of the growing towns of Tubac and Tucson in the western portion of Doña Ana County, which ran all the way to the Colorado River, were completely isolated, having to travel along the dangerous roads to Mesilla, over 250 miles away, to conduct legal business. Beginning in 1856, the inhabitants met several times in Mesilla and Tucson to draw up memorials and petitions appealing to Congress to create the territory of Arizona. But the United States government was preoccupied with the intersectional divides that would soon lead to the Civil War. It is not clear if Estevan Ochoa participated in the conventions held in 1856 and 1857, but he most likely attended the ones in Mesilla on September 3, 1858, and on June 19, 1859. The meetings were called for the creation of the territory of Arizona and to boycott New Mexico elections since its legislature and delegate were not representing them anyway. However, the contest for the New Mexico congressional delegate in 1859 was fierce, and each candidate sent representatives to convince the citizens of Mesilla that every vote counted, breaking down the previous unanimous resolve to not vote in the territorial elections. Therefore, on August 7th, a new convention was held. But instead of having delegates from all of the territory of Arizona, the attendees were only from Mesilla and a few other settlements on the west bank of the Rio Grande. The members voted to revoke the previous resolutions and promised to participate in the New Mexico elections. Upset at these rogue actions, delegates from Doña Ana, Las Cruces, Tucson, Tubac, and other settlements in the western portion of Arizona met on August 11th in Las Cruces, with Estevan Ochoa chairing the session. After the object of the convention being explained in a short and pertinent speech by the chairman, the chosen committee drafted the preamble and resolutions denouncing the actions of the renegade convention and declared that they must defend the community from, quote, a few designing men who have attempted to fix upon a set of officers to administer the affairs of the county, the majority of whom are incapable from want of intelligence and moral honesty to do justice and credit to the position, end quote. With the increase in number of Anglos in the region, many of whom were with Southern sympathies, relationships between Anglo and Mexican community leaders were subtly transforming. Throughout the 1850s, Anglo businessmen had worked amicably with the Mexican community, many of whom marrying Hispanic women and viewing the leading Mexican-American businessmen as equals. But there were signs that the Mexican leaders were made accommodations to be more accepted by the newcomers. For example, Ochoa being chosen to preside over the emergency 1859 territorial convention illustrated the respect he held in the community. However, noticeably, the local newspaper referred to him as Stephen Ochoa, anglicizing his first name. This and other small examples shows that Ochoa made minor accommodations to work with the Anglo community. In addition to political drama, the regional economic depression curtailed capital and the circulation of specie, thus inhibiting Ochoa's freighting and trade with Mexico. In response, Ochoa and Pedro Aguirre in April of 1859 terminated their partnership, but Ochoa kept the ranch in the Sonoita Valley to raise mules and oxen for his freighting business. However, the government remained his main source of income, especially his friend Dr. Steck. Ochoa continued to freight rations to various Apache groups, and he also briefly returned to his position of interpreter from January to March of 1860. Then that spring, Speck had a special request of Ochoa. The Indian agent usually, hang on, there we go, missed one. The Indian agent usually had overseen the spring planting at Santa Lucia Springs, north of present-day Silver City, New Mexico, site of the reservation for Mongus Coloradus' Gila Apaches. But this year, Stack would be on leave in the east and needed someone he thoroughly trusted to take his place. Informing his superiors of his choice, the agent referred to Ochoa as, quote, a responsible man who is well acquainted with Indians, and I have confidence in his doing well as though I were myself present, end quote. On April 10th, Ochoa took plows, hoes, spade, melon and pumpkin seeds, seed corn, and 8 hired men to Santa Lucia and spent nearly 2 months assisting the Apaches in preparing and planting their fields. After Dr. Steck's return in late summer, Ochoa continued working with the Indian Agency. In November, Steck headed out to conduct the annual distribution of rations, with his friend Estevan Ochoa hauling 19,000 pounds of presents and provisions to the Gila Apaches at Santa Lucia, the Chiricahuas at San Simon, and the Coyoteros at Playa de Santo Domingo. While Ochoa was at Santa Lucia in the spring of 1860, another territorial convention took place in Tucson, composed of delegates from the Mesilla Valley in Arizona. Although Estevan Ochoa was listed to be one of the delegates, he did not attend as he was preparing to go to Santa Lucia. The delegates to this convention decided if Congress would not organize a new territory, they would. Therefore, they drew up a constitution and elected Louis Owings of Mesilla as governor and made other appointments for the necessary offices. Although Ochoa was not present, his status and reputation was acknowledged when Governor Owens appointed him major of the 2nd Regiment of the Arizona Militia. By 1860, the economic, military, and political dynamics of the region were changing. Throughout the fall of 1860, violence between the members and Gila Apaches and the miners and farmers of the Mimbres Valley and the new town of Pinos Altos was increasing. Unfortunately, events were unfolding that proved to be beyond anyone's control. On December 4, 1860, James Tevis led a group of 30 miners from Pinos Altos and Santa Rita del Cobre and attacked one band of Mimbres Apaches that had remained peacefully camped on the Mimbres River near the newly established Fort McLean. Then, a month later, on February 3, 1861, at Apache Pass, Lieutenant George Bascom failed to capture the Chiricahua Apache leader Cochise in the mistaken belief his band was responsible for the kidnapping of Felix Ward, resulting in several days of violence. After the attack by Tevis's group and the Bascom affair, Cochise and Mongas Colorados declared war on the Americans. Estevan Ochoa in March hauled rations to Fort McLean with Pinckney R. Tully, who was serving as acting Indian agent during another absence by Steck, and the two found only a few Mimbres camped there. By May, no Apaches appeared for their handout. Pinckney Tully had closed a store in Santa Barbara in the spring of 1860 after Fort Thorne was abandoned the year before and had moved to Las Cruces to start preparations to open a new store in Mesilla. By the autumn of 1860, he had a change of plans when he and Estevan Ochoa decided to join forces and partner in their own mercantile and freighting firm, but their plans were soon derailed. The outbreak of the Apache War, combined with the rapid movement toward national civil war, had created a struggling economy in the Mesilla Valley. As an example of how dire the circumstances were, Ochoa wrote Dr. Steck in late March of 1861 that he had just freighted from Sonora a load of flour, which normally would sell rapidly, but 10 days later he had not even sold enough to pay his teamsters. And a lot of this one here is an example of some of the original documents that I found. They're actually in the Michael Steck collection, which is available online from University of New Mexico, Center for Southwest Research. In addition to the economic depression, national politics soon directly impacted the Mesilla Valley. Many of the leaders of Mesilla and Tucson were Southern sympathizers, even holding a convention in each city in March of 1861, in which they avowed not to recognize the Black Republican administration, in other words, the Lincoln presidency. By mid-June, Confederate flags were flying in Mesilla. Then on July 25th, Colonel John Baylor and the Confederate Texas Mounted Rifles appeared in Mesilla and within 2 days took control of the region. Estevan Ochoa appears not to be in the Mesilla Valley during much of its occupation by the Confederates. Although his movements for the remainder of 1861 are unknown, by the early part of 1862, he definitely was in Tucson. When Confederate troops arrived in the Old Pueblo on February 28, 1862, their commander, Major Sherrod Hunter, called on all businessmen to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. Estevan Ochoa was one of a few who declined. According to John Bork, Ochoa, when meeting with Hunter, defiantly replies that he, quote, owed all he had to the world, in the world to the government of the United States, end quote, and he would never take an oath of fidelity to any hostile power or party. Ochoa had his assets confiscated and was allowed only minutes to gather a few supplies, belongings, and his horse before being escorted out of Tucson. He most likely headed south to Mexico, where he had many business connections, and despite the threat of the Apaches, Ochoa made it to safety. Ochoa was back in New Mexico at Fort Craig by June of 1862. By this time, most of the Confederates had already retreated back down the Rio Grande into Texas, with only a small rear guard remaining in Mesilla. With the Union force of the California Column on the way to retake the Mesilla Valley, supplies needed to be sent to Las Cruces for the troops' use upon their arrival. The civilian contractor responsible for hauling these provisions was none other than Estevan Ochoa. His train traveled as close as possible behind the military detachment. However, it fell behind, and on July 30th, the wagons were attacked by Apaches who killed 13 draught animals. Within a day of this, Ochoa received word that the advance of the California Volunteers had arrived in the Mesilla Valley, and traveling in his own private carriage, he hurried on ahead of his wagons to return to his home in Las Cruces for the first time in many months. To rebuild his fortunes, Ochoa relied on government freighting contracts, and by September of 1862, he was heading north up the Rio Grande to get more supplies for the California volunteers. As he and his train traversed the Jornada del Muerto, Ochoa and his teamsters came across a bear with the remains of a haversack near him. The bear was the mascot of Company K of the 5th U.S. Infantry, which was marching ahead of Ochoa's trains. In snagging a bacon-filled haversack from the baggage wagon, the bear had dropped its prize. Jumping out to retrieve it, it had broken its chain and got left behind. At the next evening's camp, as Ochoa's train passed by, the soldiers observed that one of his wagons was adorned with a bear skin and 4 quarters of fresh bear meat. Upon inquiry, Ochoa explained that he and his teamsters happened to cross this bear in the road, and, quote, finding that he had either got to leave it or kill it, he chose to put a ball through it and got some fresh meat. By early 1863, Estevan, Ochoa, and Pinckney Tully were able to resume their plans and formally establish the firm of Tully and Ochoa with freighting and mercantile stores as their focus. In April, at the public auction of confiscated property of local Confederates, Tully and Ochoa bought a building a block south of the plaza, and the partners opened a store that summer. Meanwhile, the U.S. Congress finally created the territory of Arizona in early 1863, but with a north-south configuration. Mesilla and Las Cruces remained in the territory of New Mexico, something that was anathema to many in the Mesilla Valley, including Ochoa. Therefore, when the citizens convened a meeting in early April of 1863, Ochoa was one of the committee of 4 that wrote the preamble and resolutions stating their grievances and recommendations. Ochoa and the others asked to have Doña Ana County to be included in the new territory of Arizona, or if that was not possible, to be separated into its own territory with El Paso, Texas, and be called the territory of Montezuma. When neither happened, Estevan Ochoa moved his residence from New Mexico to Arizona. He and Tully recognized the growing number of opportunities in the new territory, especially with various mining operations resuming and with growing presence of military troops. Therefore, the partners agreed to divide the firm's operations, with Tully remaining in Las Cruces at the firm's headquarters, while Ochoa worked out of Arizona. But before they could expand their business, they needed to shore up the finances of their new firm. With money in short supply in New Mexico and Arizona, government freighting contracts were the most reliable source of funds. In late December of 1863, Ochoa procured the contract to haul governmental supplies from the military depot at Fort Yuma on the Colorado River to the depot of Tucson. Throughout the spring of 1864, Ochoa was constantly on the road. By the end of the year, the partners had been able to accumulate a reserve of money to invest in new opportunities. The reemergence of Tubac as a mining and trade center provided one. In December of 1864, Tully and Ochoa purchased a building and lot from Manuel Gándara, former governor and caudillo of Sonora. Initially, the Tubac operation had more activity than their store in New Mexico, but Indian hostilities in the area and the closure of the nearby mines once again caused settlers to leave Tubac. However, nearby Tucson had become the regional trading center for the military, miners, and ranchers. At some point in early 1866, the firm of Tully and Ochoa moved their Arizona store to Tucson. The continued economic doldrums of the Mesilla Valley convinced the partners to concentrate their operation in Arizona, and by 1868, Tully had joined Ochoa in Tucson. The wisdom of their decision was borne out over the next decade as Tully and Ochoa became the largest freighting and mercantile firm in the region, employing over 100 men at one point. As with any business, there is always risk, and freighting was one of the riskiest. Tully and Ochoa wagon trains had to deal with impassable roads, flooded rivers, and the constant danger of attacks from hostile Apaches. One report estimated that from 1868 to 1877, the firm suffered about $35,000 in losses, or over $900,000 in today's value. The most famous loss occurred in May of 1869 when Aravaipa Apaches attacked their wagon train near the present-day biosphere on the north side of the Santa Catalinas near Cañón del Oro, almost the exact same location at which 10 years before, in March of 1859, Estevan Ochoa and Dr. Steck had distributed presents to the same Aravaipa band who had promised peace with the Americans. But the partners overcame these losses and by the mid-1870s reached their zenith. Early in his career, Estevan had earned a reputation of strict honesty in his business affairs, as well as one who spent his time and money to help those in need. He took his civic duties seriously, but he often focused on the best way to assist those in Mexican-American communities. He believed that education was the key, whether formal or learning trade skills. While in New Mexico, he adopted several young boys who were in some sort of difficult situation, paying to send them back east for a formal education. If one of his charges was not adept at book learning style of education, he made sure they learned a marketable skill, like blacksmithing. In Tucson, he focused on the idea of establishing a public school system, working closely with Territorial Governor A.P.K. Safford on this issue. For this and other reasons, Ochoa entered politics, serving in the Arizona Territorial Legislature in 1868, 1871, and 1877. It was during his tenure in 1871 that he introduced the bill that created the first Arizona public school system. In 1874, he was elected as one of the 3 Tucson school trustees who were charged with constructing a public school building on a lot provided by Tully Ochoa and Company. When the public monies ran out, Ochoa personally donated $5,000 to finish construction. One of the reasons for the firm's prosperity was that Ochoa and Tully diversified their business, acquiring land west, south, and east of Tucson on which to raise livestock, not just mules and oxen, which they needed for their freighting operations, but also large herds of cattle and sheep. But Ochoa was not only looked out for the firm, he also looked out for employment opportunities for the citizens of the community. His generosity and care was noticed, with the editor of the newspaper proclaiming, quote, "No other man has given us as much thought and attention to the development of the capacities of our country as Mr. Ochoa, always watching out for something to introduce," end quote. Ochoa believed new industries would be beneficial to all, businessmen and ordinary residents alike. In the large corral of Tully and Ochoa and Company, he tested out potential opportunities. One of his ideas was to encourage a nascent weaving industry that was emerging with the growing commodity market of wool. So he kept some of his wool, the wool from his firm's flocks, and set up 2 looms in one corner of the corral. He hired several men and taught them how to card, spin, and weave blankets. This is just a modern example from the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, one of their big days that they show you. They did it from sheep to shawl is what they called it, showing it from shearing all the way. It took, 3 days to make the shawl? About 3 days to get it all woven and everything. Ochoa hoped he'd be able to produce enough blankets to not only sell in their store, but also provide to the government, all the while increasing employment opportunities for local citizens. In another corner of the corral were 2 smelters, evidence of Ochoa and Tully's interest in mining. Although Ochoa had an interest in a mine in New Mexico, it was Sidney DeLong who introduced them to the Arizona mining scene. The 2 men had brought in DeLong as a partner in 1870 to manage Tully and Ochoa and Company's store at Fort Bowie. In addition to the mercantile business, DeLong was extremely interested in mining. He constantly explored various locations and either made his own claims or invested in others. In 1874, he convinced Ochoa and Tully to invest in a copper mine in the Santa Rita Mountains. The firm used their wagons to haul the first load of ore, 5,000 pounds worth, to Tucson to be smelted in Tully and Ochoa's corral. This was the first evidence of the potential of the Santa Ritas, setting off a mining boom. However, like many business mining ventures, the difficulty in transporting the ore to faraway markets proved insurmountable to make a profit, and nothing came of the enterprise. By mid-1870s, Ochoa's wealth had increased substantially, and he was able to enjoy some of the finer things of life. In 1876, he built a large, beautiful residence on the northeast corner of Camp Street, now Broadway, and Stone Avenue in Tucson for his family. Apparently, Ochoa had met Altagracia Salazar about 1870 when she was quite young and had a relationship with her. However, she left for Magdalena, Sonora, where she bore Ochoa's son out of wedlock. There is some evidence that they might have married in 1871 in Sonora and returned to live in Tucson soon thereafter. In 1875, he and Altagracia added to their family by adopting Juana Chavez, daughter of a single mother who had fallen on hard times. 2 years later, Estevan and Altagracia renewed their vows in an official church wedding at St. Augustine Cathedral, an affair described in minute detail by the local newspaper, including the bride's blue dress. With Altagracia as the hostess, the Ochoa's social gatherings were the talk of the town, with all commenting on the lavishness of the house, including peacocks wandering through the parlor. In the latter part of the 1870s, Tucson continued to prosper, but as business leaders like Ochoa and Tully understood, ease of access to outside markets dampened the true potential of the economy. Thus, they joined in advocating for the Southern Pacific to build a transcontinental railroad through Arizona. The first train rolled into town on March 20th, 1880, and as a sign of deep respect, Tucson inhabitants chose Estevan Ochoa to present the ceremonial silver spike to Charles Crocker, the president of the Southern Pacific, at the celebration that day. This is a mural that is currently being painted at the Southern Arizona Transportation Museum. They were kind enough to let me borrow this from their Facebook page. But that's the completed proposal, and then you can see that they just posted yesterday that they had gotten started painting it by the artist Bill Singleton. Most historians have discussed the irony of merchants clamoring for the railroad only to face major business reversals due to its operation. Tully, Ochoa and Company is usually touted as the prime example of their demise. However, Estevan Ochoa and Pinckney Tully were shrewd businessmen and had experience and adapted to many changes in both New Mexico and Arizona. They had made their fortune and both were getting older. The constant effort to deal with the ups and downs of the economy, waiting for payment from the government, and the Indian hostilities had all taken their toll. As early as January of 1878, Tully opened up to their old friend Dr. Steck, quote, very tired of the everlasting hunt for $1 and would quit were if not for Mr. Ochoa, who wants to continue a little longer, end quote. After the arrival of the railroad, they did not quit, but shifted their focus of their firm. They downsized their Tucson store and divested themselves of most of their branch stores, keeping only the ones in Pantano, Wilcox, and Pinal City near present-day Globe. They concentrated their freighting on shorter hauls, such as taking government supplies to military posts from the rail stations in the eastern part of the territory. They seemingly concentrated their main ranching operation on their large spread near the Pantano store at Cienega, straddling both sides of the Pantano Wash from Rincon Valley east to the Mescal Arroyo. However, the partners still desired to invest their money in new ventures. Mining fever had hit southern Arizona, and the partners succumbed to its lure. In 1880, with the organization of the Helvetia Mining District, Ochoa, Tully, and DeLong decided to develop the Omega Claim, where they had made in 1877 that was in the heart of the new rich field. They brought in new partners, Fred Hughes, a local gambler, and Tom Jeffords, former Indian agent for the Chiricahua Apaches. By early 1882, the men recruited several investors from Philadelphia and organized the Omega Mining Company, with Tully, Ochoa, and Company being the majority shareholder. It seemed as if Ochoa had once again adapted to the latest market realities, but then the economic boom in southern Arizona abruptly came to an end. After decades of success, Estevan and Ochoa and Pinckney R. Tully now faced a series of major setbacks that ultimately led to the demise of the renowned firm. The first legal setback came in 1881 when they lost a libel suit to the Calabasas Land and Mining Company, costing them $100,000. The next year, the Eastern investors in the Omega mine sued, claiming mismanagement. By the time this legal problem was settled in early 1883, copper prices had tumbled, forcing the closure of the Omega mine in August of that year. With debts piling up, Tully, Ochoa, and Company downsized their remaining mercantile operations and borrowed money from other Tucson businessmen in hopes of getting back on their feet, but they were unable to turn the tide. In early summer of 1884, their largest creditor, J.S. Vosburgh, foreclosed on his mortgage. Consequently, on July 5th, at a public auction was held to sell off assets of Ochoa and Tully, consisting of their property in and around Tucson and the lands along the Cienega Creek. Vosburgh bought the acreage on the Cienega, and only a few days later, he and Walter Vail officially entered a partnership in the ranch, separate from the Empire Land and Cattle Company. After Vail and Vosburgh dissolved their partnership in 1889, the Cienega Ranch was incorporated into the Empire Ranch. After the settlement of the firm's affairs, Ochoa and Tully ended their long-time partnership. Even with their losses, both men still retained enough resources to live comfortably. Ochoa and his wife remained in their showcase home in Tucson, but he often visited his elderly mother in Las Cruces. During one of these visits, Estevan Ochoa suddenly died on October 27, 1888, at age 57. He was buried in the San Jose Cemetery in Las Cruces. His grandson removed his remains to Tucson in 1840 to be buried next to his son, who died in 1902, and his wife, Altagracia, who died in 1907. Although the financial empire of Estevan Ochoa and his longtime partner, Pinckney R. Tully, ended with its dismantling, Ochoa was still highly regarded in Tucson. He remained the leader of the Mexican-American community, advising them in various civic affairs and politics. Whenever the territorial period of Arizona is discussed, almost inevitably, Ochoa's and Tully's names appear as symbols of success in the risky industry of freighting and mercantilism. However, the true depth of Estevan Ochoa's character is often overshadowed by his business success. Born in Chihuahua, Mexico, raised by a mother who instilled gentlemanly manners and a sense of responsibility to his fellow man, Estevan Ochoa did have several histories. He interacted on friendly terms with famous Apache leaders like Mongas Colorados of the Gilas and the Cochise of the Chiricahuas, while also having a burning dislike for other Apache bands, especially the Pinals, who attacked and killed many in southern Arizona, including his own Teamsters. He diligently strove to seek ways to help ordinary citizens. Ochoa understood a prosperous economy was the best way to assist all people, but especially the Mexican-American community. Therefore, he got involved in politics in both New Mexico and Arizona to push for advantageous policies. He advocated for public education and pushed for innovative industries to provide employment. The citizenry and business leaders awarded his efforts by electing him as Tucson's first Mexican-American mayor in 1875. From his arrival in the United States in 1852, Estevan Ochoa witnessed the rapid development of New Mexico and Arizona and embraced it, adapting his own business and personal life as best he could. Ultimately, he has left a legacy of honor and integrity, especially in his adopted home of Arizona. Any questions? Doug?
Just a statement. The Glumtown building was claimed by Tully, Ochoa, DeWall, Nick Rogers, and Tom Jeffords.
Right.
It's just east of here.
Right.
And question, I understood that Ochoa had a very large ranch, sheep ranch, down around Palominas.
Yes, as I said, he had sheep everywhere. That is one that we do know about, is the one by Ochoaville. They named it after him. Also, too, I found reference, I have got to trace this down a little bit more, of them having a cattle and maybe sheep ranch just around Green Valley, basically, in that area. There was some, the newspaper editor was taking a trip down to Santa Cruz and naming off things and mentioned that. So I'm not sure if that was sheep there as well as cattle, but I think he usually intermingled the two livestock. And like I said, he had mules too for his freighting operation. And oxen, yes.
I was going to ask you about the Ochoaville, because it's down in Palominas down there. There was a report that at one time there were over 80 people living there. Does that make any sense that there would have been that many?
His put it this way, we will build it, they will come. It was kind of that kind of moment. He had his camp down there, and because things were, there was mining in Sonora, there was a lot of activity just down in that area, and it was, they could all gather together, be safe. It was right on the San Pedro, so there was water supply. It was a crossing, a known crossing of the San Pedro, and it was just kind of one of those natural areas. And yes, there was, I think it was by the 1890s, there might have even been more than that, but Ochoa is long gone, of course, by that point, but the settlement stayed. It was one, I remember reading something about when they were talking about building a railroad from the Santa Cruz over toward Bisbee, et cetera, that they were looking at places to have it cross, and that was one of the possible places. So it was a very popular crossing.
I think they said that his freighting business was able to go into Mexico to bring stuff across. And that was one of the things that, because of the location of the railroad, we had access to both countries. As far as I know, as late as the 60s, you could still find adobe buildings down there. But somebody said they've been down there in the last 10 years and you can't even find where it is. Everything is melted into the ground since then, of just the adobe that was there.
Yeah, it's probably one of those occasions the brush has probably covered whatever's left. So it's, I need to get down there. It's one of those things that just haven't quite got there yet, so.
Foundations are visible.
Foundations are visible, even through the brush. We've had a couple of wet years, I didn't know on that, so. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you. And we don't get to all the way yet.